As Johnny Bellamy, and Mr. Bellamy is from North Carolina, and he served in the Korean War. He's been married for over 50 years. His wife interprets Harriet Tubman, but she couldn't join us today. And he's involved with various Civil War reenactor groups, the NAACP, the Detroit Black Storyteller Association, and the National Black Storyteller Association. So I'm sure it'll be a delightful presentation today, and I would like you to join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Can I say good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Johnny Bellamy, but I come today as Frederick Douglass to tell you the story. I've become the character myself. I was born in the state of Maryland, a little town called Tuckahoe. My mother's name was Harriet. I was taken from my mother when I was 2 months old and given to my grandmother, Betsy. She'd taken me and raised me until I was 6 years old. So one day she said, "Frederick, we're going on a journey." I was overjoyed because I'd never been anywhere. I played with Tuckahoe Creek, played with the frogs, and she had a few chickens. But my grandmother's very smart. She knew how to preserve potatoes. She'd bury them in the ground. She'd put a layer of straw, potatoes, another layer of straw. And she made fishing nets. She made a living like that. She was too old to work in the fields. But this particular time, she said, "Frederick, we're going on a journey." I was overjoyed because I'd never been anywhere, walked around. So one hot August day, as we walked down this long, dusty road, I become thirsty. There was no water, so I tugged on my grandmother's skirt. And she says, "What's wrong?" I told her I was thirsty. So she picked me up and carried me for a while. So as we walked down this road, I looked up and I saw this huge house. Sort of frightening for a young kid. It was Captain Aaron Anthony's home. As we walked down the long pathway, I never knew I had siblings. I had a brother, Perry, and a sister, Eliza. So we walked in the house. The housekeeper's name was Aunt Katie. Everyone was elder, was an aunt. So she gave us water. She young girl come out of the house, says, "Grandma's gone." So I ran to the gate, and I looked down the road. I didn't see my grandmother because she never left me before. My grandmother never did see me before. So I fell to the ground. I began to cry. My brother Perry gave me a peach. I threw it away. Cried myself to sleep that night. Had to sleep on the ground. There was no covers. Had this long canvas that the children slept under. The horn blew that morning. Moses here come out, blew the horn. All the children had to get up to eat. We was fed boiled corn mush. Poured into a wooden hog trough on the ground. There was no spoons or forks. There was a lot of oyster shells. They went on the coast of Chesapeake Bay. So you either scoop it up with oyster shells or eat with your hand. The one who ate the fastest got the most. I went to bed many times hungry. So one time, my Aunt Esther was there. She was going to date a young man. But Captain Aaron Anthony wanted her company. She refused. So she went to date this young man. When she come back, he hooked up on a meat hook on the wall, stripped her down to her waist, and then whipped her till the blood ran down her back. I was so frightened as a kid, I hid in the closet, thinking I would be next. Never happened. But my job there was to keep the chickens out of the vegetable garden. There was no shoes or socks. On one cold day in March, my feet would crack open from frostbite. I had a long coarse-lined shirt. So one day, I was running errands for Mistress Lucretia She said, Fred, you seem like an intelligent young man. My husband and I are going to send you to Baltimore. So I was a loner. Sent me to the Baltimore. I become a companion for a nephew, Tommy. So as Tommy's mother was reading the Bible, happened to look over her shoulder, saw these strange marks in the book. I knew they meant something. I was very curious. I said, can you teach me how to read? She said, yes, because she never owned a slave. She taught me my ABCs. I learned them very quickly. Taught me short sentences. I learned them very quickly. She told her husband Hughes about it. She was very pleased, and he became very angry. See, a slave only supposed to obey his master. It's against the law to teach him how to read. But she never taught me anymore. When I went up in the attic that night, I knew something in that book would set me free. I was curious. There were some young white kids I played with in the neighborhood. We'd wrestle, come around, and I would take bread from the master's kitchen. I'd give them bread and butter to teach me how to read, teach me my letters. So one day, I told Gus, I said, I can make letters better than you can. He says, no, you can't. I said, yes, I can. So we debated. So he said, well, then do it. I said, I made my letters, I made them upside down in the sand. And the boys began to laugh. I wanted to cry, but I held my tears back. I said, well, then show me how to do them right side up. Which they did. And one of the fellas bought a book called Columbine Orator. This is about a slave who beat his master so well, he had to set him free. I was very curious. I wanted this book. So I shined shoes, boot black. I made 50 cents. I bought this book. I'd take it down by Smith's Wharf. I'd read it. I had to hide it because I wasn't allowed to bring books or papers in the house. But Tommy was going to school. Whenever they left, I'd always sneak and get Tommy's books, and I'd learn how to make letters. When I'd take them upstairs, I had a Bible. I was allowed to read a Bible. I'd take a Bible up. But I'd copy letters out of the Bible. I found this old Webster dictionary, took it home. I started copying out the dictionary. That's where I learned how to read and write. So something happened. Thomas and his brother Hughes got in an argument. He said, send me my slave back, Frederick back. So I was sent back to Tuckahoe, to St. Michael's. There I become a field hand. Because I wouldn't obey Master Thomas, he told me the city had ruined me. He said, you stubborn. So he sent me to a slave breaker named Ed Corvey. He could break the spirit of any slave. My first day there, he gave me a team of unbroken oxen. He said, go bring in some firewood. This was in March. So I'd taken the oxen down, I never driven the oxen before. Had the sled. As we went down in the wood, the oxen broke and ran, they tangled themselves up in the trees. I freed them, lowered the sled. On my way back, they broke and ran again. They drove me against the fence and broke the fence. So Master Kerry come out, told me I was lazy. So he said, come go with me. So he took me back into the woods, cut some branches off a tree, told me to take my shirt off. I refused. So I ripped the shirt from my back. They whipped me with the 3 branches until they broke. As the blood ran down my back, it would take weeks for it to heal. That was one of the first whippings I got. But I got many whoopings after that. So one day in August, John and I was fanning wheat. I passed out from a heat stroke. So he asked John, said, what's wrong with him? He said, he's sick. He said, no, he's lazy. So Kerry came out, kicked me in the side, told me to get up and go back to work. I couldn't move. So he picked up a slab of wood, hit me in the forehead. As the blood gushed from my forehead, he was distracted. I managed to crawl away in the cornfield. He told me to come back, but I ran, went to Master Thomas' house. He was my slave master, he was my owner. I went to his house, some 5 miles away. I told him Kerry was going to kill me. He said, no, it's not a good religious man. He wouldn't do that. He said, you must go back. So I spent the night, gave me a dose of salt, put salt on the wounds. I can imagine how that felt. On my way back, I walked in the woods. I met this gentleman named Perry. His wife was a free woman, but he cut wood for a living. I told him what had happened, so he taken me to his house. His wife gave me food, but he was risking his own self, risking his own life. So as I patched my wounds, on my way back that Sunday morning, Master Kerry and his wife was on the way to church. He was very pleasant. He said, bring in the livestock, which I did. I was pleased. So Monday morning, as I was throwing, he said, go throw the hay out, go feed this livestock. As I was throwing the hay out, the bundle off, walked up and seized me by the legs, commenced to pull me down. I fought back. He asked for help. No one would come by and give him a hand. They told him, we're here to work, not to help you whip someone. So he told me, so you get up, you scoundrel, and go back to work. I wouldn't have whipped you so hard, but I knew I wanted to fight. But hitting the slave master at that time was a hanging offense, but he never told because he had lost his prestige. He was known as a slave breaker in the city. But it was never told. My time was up. So I went to Reverend Freeland. There he gave us a lot to eat. We didn't have to work on Sunday. I started a Sunday school. Some 40 slaves come by. I was teaching them how to read. But word got out. Master Thomas come by, some other men, and they whipped us and told us never to have this happen again. We couldn't congregate. Okay. So one Sunday, I was sitting on a tree. I watched a tall ship sail down the Chesapeake Bay. I knew they were selling out to freedom somewhere. As this bird flew by, he was whistling, singing. I said, boy, he sings so sweet. I planned my escape. Told the other fellas, people I worked with, Perry, John. I says, what we're going to do is steal a boat. Philadelphia's only 100 miles away. We can go down Chesapeake Bay to freedom. As I written out passes, and Perry got scared. He told me he had a bad dream that we was being portrayed. Someone told on us. The sheriff come down and told me I was a troublemaker. But they tied us to the horses. We had to walk some 15 miles back to jail. And the people yelled, hang him, burn him. When I was thrown in jail, slave catchers would come by and they would taunt us. So I hear you can't be whipped. But when we get you down Mississippi or New Orleans somewhere, we'll break you. But Master Thomas come by and take me out of jail. He said, if you be good, I'll free you when you're 23 years old. I was sent back to Baltimore. There I become a ship corker. I got a job as corking ships. I made $6 a week. I had to turn this over to Master Hughes. So one time he gave me 25 cents and told me to spend it wisely. I told him I would. So there was a society in Baltimore. These was free people, free slaves. They had a district called Underground Railroad. So I was very interested. So I went to a meeting. I was late coming back. So they took my privileges away. But I hired myself out. I made $9 that week. I take it and I give it to Master Hughes, because I was supposed to turn every penny over to him. He was very pleased. I made $9 again. He became very pleased, so he took my restrictions off. And one time he said, "Is that all?" That was it. So I met this young lady named Ann Murray. I told her what I wanted to do. She said, "Do it." She was a domestic worker. She gave me money, Plan my escape, 1838, September the 3rd, 1838. I bought a sailor's uniform. All sailors was free. I was on the sea, you're free. They had a pass. Everyone had to have a pass. So I bought this uniform, used the word Old Salt. As the train was pulling out from the station, I boarded the train. I went back to a colored car. As the conductor was coming by, checking the tickets and looking at the passes. He was in a hurry, so he didn't look at mine. I didn't look at anything like the pass I had. So I was afraid there was a gentleman that knew me, knew I was a slave. But we stared at each other, but he never opened his mouth. That was it. I got boarded a boat, went to Delaware, from Delaware, Philadelphia, from Philadelphia to New York. I didn't know anyone in New York. As I was walking the street, there was a sailor standing across the street. He asked him, "Was I trouble?" I told him, yes. So he took him into his house. He gave me food. So he took me over to Mr. David Ruggles. He was an abolitionist. So he told me, walked in the house, he wished me luck. I sent for this young lady. We got married by Reverend Pillington. And he told me New York wasn't a safe place because it had too many slave catchers. New York was a slave state also. But we were sent to New Bedford, Massachusetts. I couldn't find a job as a chip corker. I dug cellars, cleaned chimneys, chopped wood. So I was reading the paper, printed by Lord Garrison. I liked what he said. It was anti-slavery. I said, "Oh." So picked this paper up. In other words, I had to change my name from Frederick Augustus Bailey. My birth name, I'm sorry, I should have told you that. I was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. That was my birth name. But when I got to New York, I changed my name to Johnson. When I got to New Bedford, Massachusetts, there was so many Johnsons there, so I was living with Mr. Johnson. He told me I had to change my name. He was reading a book called Lady Lake by Sir Walter Scott. So it enacted a play. So the person's name was Douglas. He said, "You got to change your name." I like the name Douglas. I put another S on Douglas and that become Frederick Douglass. That's Frederick Douglass today. I met John Brown in the city of Detroit, downtown at Second Baptist Church. I'm the only one been down there. 1859. I was making a speech at the Young Men's Club. John Brown was bringing 13 people over from Kansas, called Bloody Kansas. John Brown believed an eye for an eye. So he tried to convince me to go to Harper's Ferry. I told him no. So I went back to Rochester, New York. Come and spend a week with me, still trying to convince me to go to Harper's Ferry. I told him he'd run into a steel trap because it was a government arsenal. John Brown did capture Harper's Ferry. I don't know where he ever been there or not, but it's a little small town. But Robert E. Lee, the militia, come down to capture John Brown. So 1859, December 2nd, 1859, they hung John Brown for treason. They found a note in his pocket with my name on it. So the governor of Virginia wanted to catch me and John Brown. Well, they had John Brown. They wanted to capture me so they could hang us together. Some friends come down. Albert Kelly come down from New York. Said, you have to leave. So I left, went to Canada. From Canada, went to England. Made a lot of speeches. Went to Ireland, helped Ireland get their independence from England. So they gave me the name, the Black O'Connelly.
What?
I had an Irish name.
Say the name.
Well, anyway, there was two ladies there in England. They bought my freedom for $796, $96.96. 96 cents. I come back 1847, I'm sorry. 1847, they got the money, they sent the papers, I was a free man. So they gave me money, asked me what did I want to do. I was interested in writing, started a newspaper. So I'd like for someone to tell me the name of the newspaper that I printed in 1847. Anyone know the name of the newspaper? It was called the North Star. This is what the African escaped slave followed, the North Star. And they said, what if you can't read? Well, you know, moss grows on the north side of the tree. So they would follow the moss. And they followed a Big Dipper called a drinking gourd. But when it was cloudy, say, how can you follow the drinking gourd if it's cloudy? So always look for the moss on the north side of the tree would take you north. So we allowed them to escape. I met Harriet Tubman, called her Moses. She come by Rochester, New York. I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So was my son. In other words, my son, Massachusetts was the first state that inducted blacks into the military. Little town. Talked to Abraham Lincoln. I was the advisor for the president, Abraham Lincoln. He told me, asked me to go around and recruit, see if to get blacks into the military, which I did. My three sons went into the military. They joined the 54th Massachusetts. They was the first one, volunteers. All of them was volunteers. After that, I was sent to Washington, D.C. They burned my house in Rochester, New York. So I moved to Cedar Hills in Washington, D.C. They weren't supposed to sell property to blacks, but I bought it anyway. There, I stayed there. I worked with the women's rights, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton Katie. I worked with them. And I was very pleased. I was very pleased. They wanted me to be vice president. I said, no. So I become ambassador, a consul general for Haiti, our President Hayes. Stayed there for 2 years. I come back to the States. And in other words, I was United States Marshal. I went to see my old slave master. He was on his dying bed. So I was curious and wanted to know what happened to my grandmother. He told me she was very well taken care of. But we shook hands, we left in good spirit. He said, if I was in your case, I would have done the same thing. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some questions, and everybody wants questions, I ask some questions, I can try to answer them if I can.
What a life.
Is there any questions?
How long did you live? How old?
He was 79 years old when he passed. He was buried in Rochester, New York, in Mount Hope Cemetery. Any more questions?
How did the whole thing in Haiti come about?
Beg pardon?
You said in Haiti. How did that all come about? How did you get there?
Yeah, President Hayes made me a consul general of Haiti. I was the first black to become a consul general. And I stayed there for 2 years. I left there because I know they was using it for a naval base and I didn't like the way they was doing it, so I quit the job. And I come back and resumed my newspaper. It was called Frederick Douglass Weekly.
And what did you do in England?
I made speeches.
Okay.
I talked about freeing the blacks. You know, when the 1838, England freed all the slaves.
1830?
1838. There was no slaves. The governor of England says anyone that set foot on English soil was a free person. But when I got there, the pictures didn't jump off the wall. Everybody was nice. I said, well, and I felt like a man. And that's where I made speeches, and that's when those two ladies, I made speeches, that's when they bought my freedom. And I come back here and I wrote a book called Narrated the Life of Frederick Douglass, and a lot of them says, you're eloquent, you speak too eloquent, you must not have been a slave. But that's why I wrote the book. I had to tell my slave master's name and where I was and who done it, so that's why they wanted to hang me. But I got off of that, wrote 2 books, My Abundance and My Freedom. That's another book he wrote. But I'm taking questions, anybody, yes ma'am.
What was your relationship like with Abraham Lincoln?
Beg pardon?
What was your relationship like with Abraham Lincoln?
I was an advisor.
Were you a friend as well?
Yeah, we was friends. We both grew up the same way. We were both educated. We both educated ourselves. So we sort of similar in that. He'd come and ask me to help recruit blacks in the military. As I told him, I says, the blacks are illiterate, they have no place to go, and then they didn't have anything. This is where a sharecropping come in. Because everybody had the general store, but you never got through paying your debt. You're always in debt. It's the people that was uneducated couldn't read, so they didn't know where to go. You couldn't congregate, because if you wasn't working, you'd be locked up, be incarcerated. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned something about they asked you to be vice president. Was that?
Oh, that was the latest movement.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You know, your ladies come a long way. You didn't get your freedom you didn't get the vote until 1921.
Yeah, 1921.
So you really progress. Your doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and everything. You know, the ladies couldn't own anything. Everything the ladies made, they'd go to their husbands. Even that they worked and made money, that was their husband. They couldn't own any property. But that changed. Yes, ma'am.
It sounded like you were very strong-willed,
Oh, yes.
which is really
Oh, yes.
good.
Had to be very strong-willed.
Were you angry also, or just strong-willed?
I was angry and strong-willed because I didn't like the way they was doing it. People, everyone, no person should own another person. That was my thought.
Agreed. Yeah.
You said that the man told you that your grandmother was well taken care of. Did you ever find out where she went, actually?
You know,
Where she was buried?
I tried to, they said she had a little cabin in the woods when I stayed with them as a child. They said she was very well taken. She was sold. She was too old to work too old to work. So the person that had her, there was a lot of different stories. One said she was very cruel. They left her, put her in the woods to die, being alone. But Master Thomas said she was very well taken care of. And they have a plot there for all the slaves that buried in Tuckahoe there. They have a plot there. There's a marker on all the slaves that buried there, their names and things. But no one knew the age. I didn't know my own age, although I was born 1818. But I put it in February. I put February 14th as my birthday, but they didn't keep records on slaves at that time. Yes, ma'am.
How many kids did you have and how many wives?
I had 2 wives. I had 5 children by the first wife. But Helen Pitts was my secretary. She was a white lady. That was a no-no at that time, but he married anyway. It was a big fuss, but that cooled down. But she preserved the house. She owed $5,000 on the house. The Colored Ladies Auxiliary taken over the house. They bought it, so it turned over to Park and Recreations now. So they reserved the house, rebuilt it.
Now, all this traveling you did with your wife, or did you go by yourself? You went to England and to Haiti? And
No, my wife stayed home. She had the kids. I lost my young daughter at age 11, and that really hurt at that time because I had to flee. I was a fugitive slave. So if I had come back to the United States, anybody could pick me up and turn me over to Virginia. So I stayed in England till I bought my freedom. I was sent to Master Hughes, and he signed the papers and sent them back to England, and I was free.
Was your first wife a slave? Your first wife was a slave also then, wasn't she?
No, she was a free woman. She done domestic.
Oh.
She liked gardening. She was uneducated. She couldn't read, but she was very smart. And she raised a family. She stayed there. She passed. She had pneumonia. She died 1882. She had pneumonia. And 3 years, I worked in Washington as a recorder of deed. And my secretary, Helen Pitts, I married her. She was my secretary. And my two sons worked in the printing shop in Washington, D.C. So, you know, they never wrote anything about the sons. I don't know why. But he had a niece named Rosetta. His daughter's name was Rosetta. But it was a big fuss when he married Helen Pitts, but that settled down. So you know that question come up, the question come up says, you married a white woman. I told him, I said, my dad was white. My first wife was black. I said, what's the difference? We're all the same. God made us all the same underneath our skin. So those are my words I told him. So that was it. Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna say, it sounds funny, where are you buried at?
Where am I buried at? Rochester, New York, and Mount Hope Cemetery. Believe it or not, both wives are buried. He's in the middle, and both wives are buried on each side. So he's got lots of company. Are there any more questions?
What was your Irish nickname? What was your nickname in Ireland?
Yeah, they call me the Black O'Connelly. But Lord Garrison and I made a lot of speeches there, and you know, he printed the paper Liberator. I used to read that all the time. When he was anti-slavery, Sears, who else? There's so many names. I said, being 193 years old, boy, your memory is short. Yes, ma'am.
Were most of your speeches, did they have to do with anti-slavery, or were there other
Yes,
topics?
anti-slavery. And, you know, I wrote this one time. I said I would unite with anyone to do right and no one to do wrong. I wrote that speech in 1855. You know, I was the first delegate to go to Chicago. And I come through Michigan here. And I guess Michigan was called, it wasn't a territory at that time. And it made a state, I guess. Matter of fact, Second Baptist is 1836. It's older than the state of Michigan. This was established by 13 free blacks. You know, Finney's Barn, I don't know where he's been downtown or not, but there's a plaque downtown on State Street where Finney's Barn was. They used to hide the slaves in there, and slave catchers would come by and... Yes, ma'am. Oh. the slave catcher would come by and he'd get them drunk, and he'd slip them over to Second Baptist Church, and the code name was Midnight, because they traveled by midnight. They traveled at night. Some of them said they would run across the Detroit River, but it was shallow at that time. They could walk across, really. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Anybody more questions? And yes, ma'am.
You said you were a conductor on the railroad.
The Underground Railroad.
Yes. What was the most dangerous part?
Hiding people. Because the slave catcher would come by, if they catch someone going in the house, they would come by and you'd be arrested or fined. But during the Underground Railroad, those guys, the people took their lives in their own hand. And everybody asked for a railroad. There was no railroad. Being an Underground Railroad was from house to house. You know, Novi's had the Underground Railroad, Cassopolis, Michigan, Marshall, Ann Arbor, and Jackson. All of it was, they hid the slaves.
Did anybody write down the text to some of your speeches? Are they published somewhere? Or
Harvard University have all the speeches. I wanted to buy some, but they were $250 for a speech.
You mean you can't get it on the internet?
I went to the Library of Congress. I do that every now and then when I get Library of Congress when we do research. And I couldn't find anything and found his book that he wrote, but found out that Harvard University have all his speeches. If you want them, you can purchase them for $250. I said you have to have gold on them. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever read Sojourner Truth?
Yes. They didn't get along because she spoke Dutch, and when was the church? Yeah. She spoke Dutch, and you know, by him speaking so eloquent, he would talk in a flat voice, and he didn't like that. But it was all working for the same cause. And Harriet Tubman, she would always go down. She told her mother and father, next time I come down, you're going. So if you don't, you die here. So she carried a pistol with her all the time. No, she couldn't read or write. But her father was a farmer, and he taught her all the things that she could eat out in the forest, in the woods. And she saved something like, they said 300 people. She went back 19 times and saved 300 people, brought them to freedom. Any more questions? Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate this.